On the night of October 31st, 1941, a single torpedo found its mark in the cold black water of the North Atlantic, and Halloween was transformed into a moment of grim clarity, a night that made the distance between isolation and engagement suddenly very small. The destroyer moved with the steady confidence of a ship that had been built for purpose and practice. She belonged to a navy that had been edging closer to war without admitting it. The United States Navy was escorting convoys to Britain and probing the Atlantic to protect the lifelines of the free world. On that night, an enemy submarine traced its shadow along the convoy route and launched the weapon that split the hull and hurried 100 and more sailors into the ocean. A vessel named Reuben James went down before an official declaration of war, and the spectacle of sailors in the cold sea sharpened public opinion like a whetstone. The years that led to that night are essential to understand. The great strategic contest in the Atlantic began long before any formal declaration. Germany had decided that Britain would be strangled by denying its supplies and food and crude oil. The U-boats were the tip of that economic spear. Germany had perfected a strategy based on stealth and attrition. Admiral Karl Donitz believed that by sinking millions of tons of merchant shipping, he could starve Britain into surrender. He organized submarines into hunter packs that would shadow convoys and strike at night when the shadow of the sea belonged to them. Britain answered with convoys and escorts, and improving technology, sonar and high-frequency direction finding and airborne patrols gradually tightened the net. But in 1941, the balance remained fragile, and every convoy that slipped through was a lifeline, and every convoy that was mauled was a step toward strategic collapse. America watched with a mixture of sympathy and fear. The nation had been reluctant to enter the European war, and isolationist sentiment ran deep. Yet, the economic and moral ties with Britain pulled American policy inexorably toward intervention. President Roosevelt balanced careful public statements with decisive private action. Lend-Lease had already committed American industrial power to the Allies in a manner unmatched by any previous peacetime program. United States merchant ships and Navy vessels were escorting convoys and performing neutrality patrols, and small incidents gradually widened the gap between official neutrality and de facto belligerence. In September, the Greer incident had ratcheted tensions higher. A destroyer and a German submarine exchanged fire in waters where America was patrolling, and the president responded with orders that effectively authorized American warships to engage U-boats on site under certain circumstances. That order did not equal a declaration of war, but it changed the rules of engagement, and it placed American sailors directly in the firing line on the high seas. Reuben James was a symbol of that change in posture. She was an American destroyer performing escort duty for merchant convoys that still bore the scars of earlier battles. Her crew believed in the mission, and they believed in the protection of vital supply lines to Britain. On the night of Halloween, the Atlantic was a column of black, with glints from merchant ship lights, and the routine of keeping watch and scanning the horizon felt like a magazine of small actions that could end in catastrophe. The U-boat that found the convoy was operating with the trained calm of men who had become experts of the night. German submariners learned how to approach under cover of darkness and to exploit every little advantage that the ocean offered. The attack was quick and efficient. There is a grim poetry in the mechanics of a torpedo strike. A torpedo punched through water and metal, and every piece of the ship that encountered seawater became a calculation of survival. Watertight compartments failed or held. Boilers flooded, and steam and smoke joined with the screams of alarms and the clatter of gear. A destroyer is built to stay afloat and to fight, but when a torpedo rips into a vital area, the time between order and chaos collapses. The men below decks have moments to react, and then the dark takes them. On that night, many of those moments were extinguished without ceremony. When the hull finally surrendered to the sea, the survivors clung to rafts and debris, and the Atlantic poured bitter cold into the wounds of the living. Rescue was complicated by the need to protect the convoy and to remain watchful for more attackers. News of the sinking traveled swiftly across cables and radio waves, and the American public was forced to watch sailors die even though formal war had not been declared. The headlines were stark, and the imagery of bodies in lifeboats and cold water made an abstract debate into a human catastrophe. Partisan politics hardened overnight. Isolationists argued against escalation and warned of the perils of entanglement, and interventionists pointed to the graves in the ocean as proof that neutrality had become a fantasy. Someone must pay, and the calculus of national policy became more fraught. This was not the first American ship to be damaged by enemy action. In the months before full-scale war, the Kearney had been torpedoed earlier in October, and merchant ships had been sunk. But Reuben James carried the emblematic weight of a Navy ship sinking with loss of life, and that image carried power in American discourse. From a naval perspective, the event underscored the danger of the convoy system and the bravery of those who served in it. Escort commanders had to balance the primary mission of keeping merchant tonnage safe against the secondary mission of rescuing survivors. Every maneuver could invite further attack. Boat commanders were masters of risk assessment. They could detect the approach of a destroyer and then decide whether to strike or to shadow. Sometimes they misjudged, and sometimes they were hunted. But when they struck successfully, the damage could be decisive. The North Atlantic in 1941 was a theater of shadow warfare. One side relied on radar and sonar and aerial reconnaissance and a growing body of signals intelligence, and the other side relied on stealth, discipline, and ruthless timing. Each side forced the other to adapt or to lose patent. The captain of the German submarine that fired the fatal shot would later be known among his peers for skill and aggressiveness. German accounts recorded the strike as part of the wider campaign against Allied shipping, and the crews celebrated success even as they faced the brutal calculus of logbooks that filled with tonnage and sinkings. From the German point of view, an American destroyer patrolling with convoys was a legitimate target. The rules and conventions of naval engagement had become blurred in the cold arithmetic of survival. The Americans were escorting material to a nation at war, and that made them part of the contest. This legal and moral ambiguity pervaded the months before Pearl Harbor. Both sides justified actions with the language of necessity, and none of that language muted the human cost when a ship went down. Intelligence played a role in the Atlantic long before the formal American entry into the war. British codebreakers had achieved remarkable success at deciphering German naval communications, and that intelligence constantly shifted the chessboard. When Allied decrypts highlighted concentrations of U-boats or predicted patrol patterns, convoys could be routed to avoid the worst threats. At times those decrypts saved lives and tons of shipping, and at times the margin of safety was painfully thin. The German Navy, meanwhile, worked to evade detection and to exploit gaps in Allied coordination. They trained their crews to remain patient and to strike at the most opportune moments. The night of Halloween had all the makings of such an dull opportunity. Back in Washington, the reaction to the loss of Reuben James was immediate and complicated. The White House could not afford to ignore the domestic fury, and at the same time Roosevelt weighed the geopolitical consequences of escalating too openly before the country was ready. His public addresses after the sinking struck a tone that blended sorrow and resolve. He framed the event as part of the wider struggle to keep supply lines open to a beleaguered Britain, and he used the sinking to argue that American interests could not be left undefended on the high seas. Congress was under pressure from constituents and from opponents, and the debate in halls of power now included the living memory of men who had drowned in the Atlantic. Votes and resolutions moved in a climate that had been intoxicated by fear and righteous anger. For sailors on convoy duty, the sinking was both a warning and a call to renewed vigilance. Training intensified in the months that followed, and anti-submarine tactics improved in measurable ways. Sonar usage became more systematic, depth charge patterns were refined, and coordination with air patrols increased. Shipbuilding accelerated as well, and the United States Navy multiplied its escort fleet with ships specifically designed to protect merchantmen against submarine attack. These were slow but persistent hulls that would multiply the cost for any attacker. Industry knew that the war in the Atlantic was a war of endurance, and the industrial output of American shipyards and factories would be decisive in the months to come. The loss of a single destroyer was tragic, but it galvanized a response that increased Allied capacity in tangible fashion. There were moral complexities in the public reaction that deserve careful attention. Some commentators argued that sailors had knowingly entered danger and must accept the consequences. Others insisted that the nation had a duty to shield its citizens from foreign attack whether or not a formal declaration had been made. The line between military necessity and national pride was thin, and the debate revealed fissures in the American political psyche. The sacrifice of sailors became both a moral indictment and a rallying cry, and civic memory began to weigh the cost of distance versus the cost of engagement. While the sinking hardened many in favor of stronger measures against the Axis, it did not automatically move the entire nation to war. There remained a significant portion of the population that feared the human and economic price of full participation in a European conflict. International reaction was equally consequential and a higher pain to bid into nautic price. Churchill and British leaders used the event to illustrate the realities of the fight for survival and to deepen their plea for active American support. Allied leaders understood that symbolic losses could be marshaled as proof of commitment or of need depending on their rhetorical weight. German propaganda tried to minimize the political effect and presented the Atlantic campaign as a necessary measure against a Britain that refused to surrender. The U-boat successes were trumpet calls for morale at home even as the wider strategic picture showed their limits. Neutral nations watched as well, and the incremental erosion of neutrality in the Atlantic forecast an epochal shift in world order. The balance of global power had never been more precarious than in those cold months before December. Technically, the sinking illustrated both the power and the limits of submarine warfare. The effectiveness of a submerged torpedo had been proven time and again, but it was equally true that submarines became vulnerable when aircraft and radar improved. Each innovation in detection diminished the night advantage that U-boats had once enjoyed. American industry responded by producing more escort vessels and aircraft, and by improving the technology that could detect and prosecute submarine contacts. This technical arms race would become decisive in the later months and years of the war. The Halloween sinking therefore acted as a catalyst for innovation, as much as it acted as a political symbol. The destruction of one ship became a spur for broader capability and for the institutional learning that defines wartime adaptation. Personal stories from survivors and rescuers give the event its human face and are essential if one wants to grasp the weight of that night. Men who clung to life in freezing water later testified to the roar of steam and the lightning flash of a ship tearing itself apart. They spoke of the cold and the stinging salt and the strange silence that followed the loudest moments, the small acts of courage of men pulling shipmates from the water, and the quiet heroism of crews who turned from fighting to rescuing, are the narratives that fill the social memory of the event. Public ceremonies and memorials would later create a vocabulary of sacrifice around the name Reuben James, and the families of the lost sailors carried the grief into the partisan debates of the home front. That grief hardened resolve and widened the circle of those willing to commit to the struggle. Historians in the decades since have debated the counterfactual question of whether a different political decision in November 1941 might have led to an earlier congressional declaration of war. These discussions are inherently speculative, but they reveal the ways in which symbolic events can accelerate or decelerate political action. The Reuben James sinking increased pressure on policymakers, but it did not remove the institutional and political barriers to declaring war. The American system required a catalyst beyond naval losses to mobilize both the public and the legislature. Pearl Harbor supplied that catalyst in a manner so catastrophic that it removed any remaining pretensions to neutrality and produced the formal declarations that would bind the nation to global conflict. Yet the memory of the Atlantic nights before Pearl Harbor remains historically significant. The Reuben James and its crew symbolized the moment in which the United States stopped pretending it could remain a spectator to a total war. The sacrifices in those convoys were part of an incremental drift into full engagement that had moral and strategic dimensions. By the time formal war arrived, the Atlantic had already been a theater of violence involving American ships and sailors. The months after Halloween 1941 accelerated the logistical expansion and the doctrinal shifts that would make a global campaign sustainable. Ships and men multiplied, industrial capacity was harnessed and doctrine adapted. The death of a destroyer became part of the prehistory of a larger conflict that would reshape the world. In a narrower and more technical sense, the Reuben James episode taught hard lessons about operations. Destroyer escorts were redesigned with survivability and anti-submarine armament in mind, convoy tactics were adjusted to emphasize layered protection, and air cover was prioritized for critical stretches of passage. The tactical calculus of how escorts would position themselves evolved. Commanders learned that reckless pursuit of a contact without sufficient support could invite disaster. The strategy of patience and coordinated attack would prove more effective than piecemeal retaliation. These are the sorts of practical military lessons that commanders remember and pass on. They are the small increments of knowledge that accumulate to change the future of conflict. Memory and myth intertwined after the sinking and created the symbolic framework that later generations would use to tell the story of American entry into the war. Poems and songs and public monuments fixed the image of sailors lost in a cold ocean into national consciousness. History is always partly invention and partly record, and the way the Reuben James was talked about in newspapers and speeches shaped the way it was later remembered. The ship became both a historical fact and a moral emblem. This double identity is important to historians because it shows how factual events become interpreted through cultural lenses and how national narratives are formed in the crucible of trauma. If one looks at the wider strategic arc, it becomes clear that single events rarely determine fate by themselves, yet they do change the slope of political decision-making, and they can push leaders into different kinds of action. Reuben James did not force a declaration of war by itself, but it pushed the country further along a trajectory that already favored engagement. It hardened attitudes and it made the rhetoric of standing up to aggression more persuasive for many Americans. This incremental pressure is the real power of maritime losses in a contested ocean. Each sinking makes the cost of inaction more apparent and narrows the political options available to statesmen. On a human level, the night of Halloween 1941 remains a study in the fragility of life at sea and the bravery that people show when confronted by sudden disaster. It is a night when the machinery of war and the human heart intersected in ways that demanded moral reckoning. Those who study the event as historians must balance tactical detail with empathy for the lost and the living, and must resist the temptation to reduce human suffering to simple strategic metrics. The sailors who went down, and those who survived and the families they left behind, are the enduring testimony to the fact that history is made of individual tragedies that accumulate into collective memory. As the war accelerated after December, the lessons learned in the Atlantic in 1941 became part of the broader Allied advantage. Improved anti-submarine capabilities and sheer numerical superiority of escorts and aircraft made the U-boat threat gradually less decisive. By 1943, the tide turned in the Atlantic, and the attrition that Donitz had hoped to impose on Britain could no longer be sustained without crippling losses to the U-boat fleet itself. The industrial response and the tactical innovations had compensated for earlier vulnerabilities. The memory of nights like that Halloween remained an essential part of the narrative of American contribution to victory, and a reminder that war is often decided long before the decisive battles in distant theaters. The quiet work of convoys and escorts was central to eventual success. Looking back with the perspective of years, we can see that a single torpedo on a single night could act as both a human tragedy and as a catalyst for strategic change. The Halloween strike on Reuben James embodies the paradox that loss can produce resolve and that suffering can galvanize collective action. The story is a lesson in the interconnectedness of technological, tactical, and political factors, and it shows how narrow, lethal moments can ripple through policy and industry and culture. The sailors who served in those convoys and the ship that carried their name remain etched in history as a reminder that even before formal declarations, the moral choices of a nation are tested by fire and by the cold sea. Historians continue to examine the primary records and survivor accounts, and the archives reveal complexity that resists simple summaries. Each log entry and each letter home adds texture to our understanding and prevents the event from being reduced to a single slogan. This is the work of careful scholarship, and it matters because it preserves the dignity of those involved, and it allows us to learn from the layered consequences of action and inaction. The Halloween night of 1941 remains a case study in how discrete incidents feed into larger transformations and how nations respond when the boundary between peace and war blurs into a line of foam on a black ocean. In the end, The Reuben James is both a name and a narrative that carries the weight of that time. The ship sank before formal war, but its loss is inseparable from the wider story of American entry into the conflict, and from the broader evolution of naval warfare. If one listens to survivor testimony and reads the dispatches and the operational reports, the outline of the night becomes more than anecdote. It becomes a lens through which we see the texture of the Atlantic War and the human cost at its center. On Halloween night, the ocean kept a terrible tally, and the world moved one step closer to full engagement. The lessons of that night echo in the institutional changes that followed, and in the memory of the families who marked that loss each year. Remembering the dead is not merely an act of melancholy. It is a responsibility to learn and to adapt, and to honor the truth of what those sailors faced. The sinking of a single destroyer may not have declared the war, but it sharpened the sense of what was at stake. The Atlantic Nights of 1941 are therefore not merely prelude, but prologue. They are the slow gathering of forces and wills that would soon be unleashed on a planetary scale. On that Halloween, the sea took some of the brave, and the world kept moving toward a reckoning that would change the map and the memory of those who lived through it.